Hi everybody, welcome to Fiddlesticks and Stitches. Today's project is Ginger's Carriage and Bear. This is my first YouTube subscriber commission, along with my first stop animation video. The list of materials will be posted on my Patreon page. The link will be in the description. For this project, I actually started with a wire frame and then quickly changed my mind and decided to go with wood. For this, I'm using balsa, and I am measuring out the rounded area for the base of the carriage. My boards are going to be in the sizes 1 inch for the center and half an inch on either side, and that half an inch is going to be then split in half to finish out the rounded edge. In the end, I ended up with 5 wood pieces. You can make as many as you want to get the curvature that you want on either end of the carriage. It's up to you on that part, but I thought the 5 was a pretty good number for the curve that I needed. The pattern that I created for this will also be posted on Patreon. I used a plain old box cutter to cut out all of my pieces for this. Since this wood is so soft, it's pretty easy to get through. After I cut my pieces out, I numbered them and then I angled the edges so they'll fit together properly later. Then it's on to gluing. I used the super glue baking soda, where you put the super glue on and then you sprinkle the baking soda on top of it so that way it hardens it right away. It is the fastest, easiest way that I've found to make these wood pieces, other than clamps and wood glue where that's not always an option. This is perfect for that. 2 negatives that I've found with it is, 1, you almost always glue your fingers together, especially when it's a brand new bottle. You're most definitely going to, just like I did there. And it gets hotter than super glue does just drying on its own because, chemical reaction. And 2, it is a lot harder to sand than the wood is, so you have to be careful of it starting to get divots where the glue's not going away, but the wood is. While gluing my pieces together, I'm making sure I'm getting that curvature. And this is where you really get to decide on how deep you want it or how shallow you want it. Now we can do the sides. The piece that I just made, basically the base of it, traced around it on the side of my wood and numbered it so that way I knew which side was which. Flipped it over and did the same thing for the other side. I used my box cutter again and cut them out. I didn't bother sanding or anything like that on these pieces too much because you're not going to be able to see them. They're covered with fabric. They are just for the structure itself. Okay, while I'm busy cutting away, I wanted to talk about the things that are going on over on Patreon. I had been in a stuck position where I didn't know if I wanted to keep using it, and doing this commission has made me realize that I can adapt Patreon to this. So I went back and I changed my settings for my tiers and everything. So please go check it out. If you are interested in me making anything, it would be a good place to start. Each piece comes with a certificate of authenticity and a YouTube tutorial. Looks good. Now it's time to glue. My prompts for this project was Rosemary's Carriage and black. So I had this fabric that was originally, I believe, a corset that I took apart a while ago, but I really liked the pattern on it, so I hung on to the fabric. And when she said she wanted it black, I figured this was perfect. One thing that I felt important with this fabric was making sure that my pattern matched all the way around. After cutting the sides, I glued them on the inside of the carriage first, and then I went on to make the mat. For the mat inside of the carriage, I actually used a little rectangle piece of a yoga mat and covered it with a different textured fabric than the rest of the carriage. While gluing the fabric to the mat, I left the ends open. I'm going to use those and attach them to the carriage itself. And to do that, I sat the mat inside of the carriage and folded the edges over and tacked them down with some super glue. I missed some recording of attaching the sides and creating the canopy. I will have detailed instructions on my Patreon on how to make those. Now that we have the bassinet portion of the carriage done, it's time to move on to the base. For this part, I used wire, wood beads, and dowels. After drawing out my plans, it was time to start bending wire. The first part I started with was the pieces that were going to be attached to the axle. I made a loop at each end of the wire and then traced my pattern and bent the wire along it. And I did this times 2. To make the handbar for the carriage, I used a Altoids can. It was just the right size that I needed. After shaping, I added some beads and then I put a curve in it with my ruler. For the wrapping, I used copper speaker wire in groups of 3. the wheels for this project, I used the thicker black wire that I had used for the frame and wrapped it around a medicine bottle once to get me a nice circular shape. I used the super glue and baking soda mix to glue it into that circle, and then I wrapped it with simple twine. For the spokes on the inside, I used the speaker wire in 3-strand groups and started wrapping around the tire itself, and then I added the beads as I went. took thin aluminum, drew circles, and cut them out and glued them to the center of the tires. After test fitting the body, I realized that I needed one more piece to the framework, and again, using the Altoids can, I bent my piece of wire. This is for the front end. It will act as a pretend support. And to attach it, I just wrapped the 3-strand copper wire around as I did before. a final coat of black paint, it was time to assemble. To create the axle, I first cut my dowel and glued one dowel and one wheel together and let it dry before attaching the other one. I put the dowel through to the other side, put a dab of glue on, and put on the other wheel. I used a piece of string just to tie it together until it dried. Yay! Time for the teddy bear. Okay, to make the bear, I combed my cat. Yes, this bear was made from donated fluff from the wonderful Miss Frankie. To make the bear, I took the balls of fluff and rolled them in my fingers like you would a ball of lint until it was compacted tight enough to hold its shape. For the head, I just made a simple ball, and for the body, I made it a little bit narrower towards one end. To make the ears, I took an even tinier piece of fluff and rolled it into a ball and cut it in half, one for each ear. For the tail, I did a teeny tiny ball of fluff just like I did for the ears, I just didn't cut it in half. For the arms and legs, I just rolled out snakes of fluff, the arms being shorter and smaller than the legs, and cut them in half. Cue the music. Now it's time to glue all of our pieces together and see what our bear looks like. I gave him a quick trim and painted some eyes and a nose on. Now our teddy bear is ready. I would like to thank Ginger. Thank you so much for making this a project for me. It has been an amazing adventure, and I really do hope you like it. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and as always, I'll see you next time.